The committee will come to order, and I might say Mr. Rush is on his way, and we've discussed it with the various members, so we're going to go on and start our opening statements, and the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Today we meet to mark up H.R. 910, the Energy Tax Prevention Act. Today we take the first step to reassert legislative authority over EPA and to stop EPA's effort to issue global warming regulations that would increase our electricity costs, our gasoline prices, send more jobs to China, and make America less competitive in the global marketplace. Congress on three separate occasions has clearly stated methane, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and other gases should not be regulated by EPA. The first time was the last time the Clean Air Amendments were amended, 1990. An effort was made to regulate greenhouse gases. 1998, the Senate, by a vote of 97-0, sent a petition to President Clinton asking him not to send the Kyoto Protocol to the Senate for ratification. And then in 2009, the U.S. Senate refused to take up the cap-and-trade bill. Rather than accept this undeniably clear directive, the Obama administration has decided to move forward with EPA regulations that would not only cost jobs, but will increase electricity costs, gasoline prices, and make America less competitive in the global marketplace. In the hearings before the subcommittee, we heard from witnesses representing manufacturing, energy producers, small businesses, farmers, coal miners, and others, all expressed their concern about EPA regulations, forcing them to either close businesses or, at a minimum, lay off workers. The administration seeks to curtail coal production in the U.S. and make it more difficult to produce electricity from coal. This is unacceptable because we simply, in America, cannot meet our demand for electricity or anticipated demand without coal. One economic expert estimated that job losses potentially would reach 1.4 million people under the regulatory scheme of EPA. Even more will be lost, and we recognize this very clearly, if the tailoring rule is found to be deficient. The widespread opposition to EPA's regulations is reflected in the support for H.R. 910 from organizations representing millions of jobs. These include the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, American Farm Bureau, National Mining Association, National Cattlemen's Association, National Association of Realtors, and National Petrochemical and Refiners Association, and others. A third hearing that we had a few days ago made it abundantly clear that the proposed EPA regulations would not solve the problem. Even when Administrator Jackson appeared before our subcommittee, she said that the regulations would not be successful if America acted unilaterally without other countries being involved. So my question is, why should we act unilaterally and place our employers and our businesses in America at an unfair disadvantage to manufacturers in China and India? And I might also say, as our distinguished colleague John Dingell noted on more than one occasion, regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act would be a glorious mess. Many of us agree with him wholeheartedly on that assessment. So today I would ask, please join us and let's stop EPA from raising electricity prices, gas prices, making American businesses less competitive in the global marketplace, and let's stop sending jobs to China. Let's pass H.R. 910. And at this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, the bill that we are marking up today is an extreme and excessive piece of legislation. This bill will eliminate EPA's authority to require common sense and cost-effective efficiency standards for the highest polluting facilities in the nation. I oppose this radical bill that would gut the Clean Air Act and roll back EPA's authority to protect public health and environment from carbon pollution. This legislation will also roll back EPA-issued and industry-supported standards to reduce carbon pollution from automobiles and trucks. These same standards will save 1.8 billion barrels of oil while saving Americans money at the pump. But the Upton-Inhofe bill will prevent additional reductions in the future. Mr. Chairman, on several occasions I've asked you to work with me on crafting legislation that will actually move our nation forward and help wean us from our dependence on foreign oil by working together on a clean energy standard. Even today, as we begin the process of marking up this uncompromising piece of legislation that will leave many American families unprotected from hazardous air pollution while allowing industry to operate unfettered and unregulated, I maintain hope that we may continue to work together and work on legislation that will provide solutions for American families and the U.S. economy. While countries such as China make significant investments in clean energy technology, which is one of the key emerging sectors of the 21st century, this bill will only provide American companies with even more uncertainties about this future, less guidance on how best to move forward, and a false sense of complacency due to the present dynamics of Washington politics. The fact of the matter is that America, as well as the world around us, is moving toward cleaner, more efficient, and more renewable energy sources. Policy makers understand this fact, as does industry leaders here and abroad. The question, Mr. Chairman, is whether we will remain the global leader in creating and manufacturing these clean energy technologies, or will we cede our leadership on these emerging industries to China and to other nations? And this is an extremely important and telling question that we must ask ourselves, because the country that leads the world in creating new energy technologies of the future, indeed, will be the nation that leads the world in the 21st century. Mr. Chairman, I sadly state that this bill does not move America forward in any sense, but rather attempts to gut EPA's ability to protect our citizens. It rolls back common sense efficiency standards, and it prevents successful vehicle standards from being strengthened and replicated in future years. Nothing, absolutely nothing about this bill advances America's interests. Our citizens are left unprotected, and the agency designed to safeguard our air quality will be left without the authority to do so. Instead of encouraging our energy companies to plan and invest and become more competitive with the trends and realities of the future, this bill encourages companies to stand pat and to keep doing business the same old way that they've been doing it for the last 50 or 100 years. If we continue to do the same old things, then how can we expect to come up with a different solution? Mr. Chairman, we're all concerned about my Republican colleagues that have the votes here today to ram this bill through the subcommittee and to push it through the full committee and even to get it through the Congress. But after that, what? Instead of working in a bipartisan manner to construct a bill such as a clean energy standard that truly moves our nation forward, protects our citizens, and provides guidelines that allow industry to plan for the future, we are here making up and marking up a radical, regressive bill that I believe will only end up as a sad and curious footnote in the history of this committee. After this committee has completed our business on this bill, I sincerely hope that you and I and other members from both sides of the aisle may begin to work on legislation that helps us plan and invest for the future. My only fear is that by the time my Republican colleagues come around to what the future is, to where the future is heading, we might have lost too much time and given China and the rest of the world too much of a head start. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. And this time, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 3 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At a time when the American people are concerned about rising gas prices and high unemployment, I cannot think of an easier decision than supporting this bill, H.R. 910, the Energy Tax Prevention Act of 2011. The bill blocks EPA's costly global warming regulatory agenda. The issues here are not new, as Congress grappled with similar legislation in 2009. And at the end of that debate, I concluded that cap-and-trade energy taxes on the fuels that provide 85% of America's energy would, in fact, impose far more economic pain than environmental gain. And I did not support the legislation. Like all of you, I support a cleaner environment. Yes, I do. But let's be honest. Neither a cap-and-trade energy tax nor EPA regs of greenhouse gases achieve that goal. For me, the decision is even clearer when it comes to EPA's attempt to impose the regulatory equivalent of the failed cap-and-trade legislation. No less an authority than EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson herself conceded that regulations would be costlier and less effective than the legislation, which was bad enough. Lisa Jackson herself noted that the staggering energy cost increases of Waxman-Markey would be the floor, with EPA regs costing American families even more at the pump, at the grocery store, and certainly on their home heating bill. The Energy and Power Subcommittee has held 3 hearings on this bill. The first addressed the economic impact of EPA's regulatory agenda. We heard from a broad cross-section of job-creating industries, including domestic manufacturers like chemical producer, FMC, and steelmaker Nucor. EPA's regs unilaterally raise energy and operating costs on American manufacturers. Those that compete in global markets stated that they are losing jobs to nations like China that have no intention of burdening their industry with similar restrictions. And once those jobs are gone, they're gone. Refinery Lions Oil testified that these regs will increase the cost of turning oil into gasoline, which will add future pain at the pump. This committee is working hard to ease the economic pains of rising gas prices. This bill is the first step. With this legislation, we will block EPA-imposed gas price increases, and next we'll work on policies to bring those prices down. Representatives of the energy sector also testified, such as Santee Cooper and the Ohio Coal Association. They warn of lower supplies and higher prices for domestic energy should EPA's global warming regs be allowed to move forward. EPA's regs are a backdoor attempt by unelected bureaucrats to implement the highly unpopular cap-and-trade legislation that was rejected just last year. They're about as out of touch with the American people with what they want as anything moving forward in Washington. This committee and others will soon turn our attention to removing other Obama administration roadblocks to domestic energy production. But our first order of business is to stop EPA's gas price global warming regulations. These hurt not only households, but they burden small businesses and farmers. H.R. 910 is carefully crafted, so careful, in fact, that critics have had to concoct misrepresentations of what this bill actually does. It's not about climate science. It's about the merits of EPA's regulations. Mr. Chairman, I would ask that the rest of my statement be put into the record and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Upton. At this time, I recognize the ranking member from California, Mr. Waxman, for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, today the subcommittee considers legislation that codifies science denial. Just 2 days ago, we heard from some of the world's leading climate scientists. They told us that climate change is real, that it is caused by humans, and that the impacts could be devastating. Their scientific conclusions are the same as those reached by the National Academy of Sciences and the premier scientific organizations of all the world's major economies. Not a single scientist agreed with Senator Inhofe and Republicans on this committee that climate change is a hoax. Yet today this subcommittee considers legislation premised on Senator Inhofe's belief. H.R. 910 won't roll back H.R. 910 would roll back the Clean Air Act and block the EPA from regulating dangerous carbon emissions from power plants, oil refineries, and other large polluters. This legislation overturns EPA's scientific finding that carbon pollution endangers health and welfare. It repeals the greenhouse gas reporting rule, and it removes EPA's authority to require energy efficiency at power plants and refineries. It also has a host of other effects, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put in the record an analysis of this legislation by our Democratic
Without objection.
In short, it is anti-science, a know-nothing, do-nothing approach to the most challenging environmental problem of our time. This bill won't stop carbon pollution from building up in the atmosphere. It won't address the public health threat facing American families. It won't stop the droughts and floods that threaten agriculture and displace families from their homes. It won't protect the air quality of our cities, and it won't stop the strange weather patterns that afflicted most of the nation. Some Republicans on the committee will argue today that this bill is not a rejection of science, but if they believed in the serious threat posed by climate change, they would have accepted our offer to work together without preconditions to develop a responsible plan for promoting clean energy and reducing carbon emissions. Instead, they've rebuffed the offer by myself and Representative Rush and are moving this extreme bill through our committee. It's hard to find common ground when one side doesn't accept that there's a problem. It's hard to know how to respond when the other side calls H.R. 910 the Energy Tax Prevention Act, but EPA has no authority to levy taxes, nor does the agency propose to do so. They claim that EPA is establishing a cap-and-trade program, but the agency has not proposed such a program and clearly stated they won't establish such a program. And yesterday, Speaker Boehner and today Chairman Upton argued that this legislation will stop gasoline prices from increasing, but it's laughable to assert that requiring new power plants and refineries to meet minimum efficiency standards is affecting prices at the pump. History will not judge this committee kindly if we become the last bastion of the polluter and science denier. When carbon emissions rise to record levels and our weather system goes haywire, the American people will ask why we acted so irresponsibly.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. I would remind all members that opening statements will certainly be made part of the record, but if anyone wants to make an opening statement, we'll recognize you for 1 minute. And are there any members? Mr. Sullivan, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Chairman Whitfield, thank you for holding the subcommittee markup on H.R. 910, the Energy Tax Prevention Act of 2011. This important legislation will help protect American jobs and businesses of all kinds from the regulatory onslaught of EPA's pending job-destroying greenhouse gas regulations. Mr. Chairman, gas prices are on the rise. Many economists predict that the price at the pump could reach $4 to $5 per gallon by this summer. Instead of working to lower the price we pay for energy, the Obama administration is actually supporting policies that will drive gas prices and utility rates even higher by pushing for this backdoor national energy tax on every single American family and small business. The simple fact is that the cap-and-trade legislation that moved through Congress last session would increase the price of gasoline by 19 cents in 2015 and 95 cents by 2050. Imposing the same policy through EPA regulations on greenhouse gas will make gasoline even more expensive, as even the EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson acknowledged. This markup is our opening salvo to show the American people we mean business when it comes to growing our economy, removing job-destroying regulations, and protecting the American consumer at the pump. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Dole, you raised your hand first. We'll recognize for 1 minute for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a minute to say a few words on the bill before us today, the so-called Energy Tax Prevention Act. Along with other members in this committee, I spent a great deal of time during the 111th Congress working on a plan to rein in greenhouse gas emissions utilizing a balanced approach that could take into consideration the effects on consumers, manufacturers, utilities, agriculture, and many other sectors of the economy. But as you all know, that bill never made it through the Senate and didn't become law. So, without a legislative approach to regulate greenhouse gases in this economy, the EPA was left to act. And so they have begun with issuing a timeline for greenhouse gas permitting for large power plants and oil refineries. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say administrative rulemakings and regulations are the perfect tool. I think that it's clear that I would have preferred a legislative solution. But I'm not going to sit here and say that the EPA should be given carte blanche to regulate greenhouse gases without consideration of its effect on our economy. But I am also not willing to say these regulations will send our jobs and industry to China. And I'm not going to say that the EPA regulations will send America's gas prices soaring. But these are some of the arguments our friends on the other side of the aisle have been using in recent weeks. And I think it's time to call their bluff. Manufacturing jobs aren't going to China or anywhere else because of these regulations. Manufacturers don't even have to apply for these permits unless they drastically expand or build a new plant. We heard that from Republican witnesses before this subcommittee. And just because it's politically convenient to invoke people's fear over rising gasoline prices doesn't mean it's responsible to pull out a study from over 2 years ago on an entirely different proposal and apply it to these regulations. Scaring the American people into supporting this bill is as irresponsible as it is untruthful. And I think as lawmakers, we can do better than that. So, as I've said many times before, I'm willing to work on a reasonable compromise that protects our manufacturers and our economy while combating the very real problem that global climate change is for our health and environment. But I hope we can all start telling the truth about what these regulations really do, and maybe more importantly, what they don't do. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Who seeks recognition on our side? Mr. Shimka is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate following my friend from Pennsylvania because greenhouse gas regulation is a job destroyer. And we've talked about this numerous times. And, you know, I talk about the coal miners who lost their job in the last time, and they'll lose their job again in this cycle. I cite the coal-fired power plant that would have to have a $2 billion plant expansion just to have the equipment to capture greenhouse gases, not including the 30% of electricity that will no longer go on the grid because it has to fund the capital expansion, and that's the energy that's needed, not to include the pipeline that has to be built, that you have to get all the right-of-ways. This is a 10-year, at least, project, and we're going to have the EPA rule by executive fiat versus the legislative branch because we legislators said no last Congress, and we're fixing the problem with this bill. I thank you, and I yield back my time.
A gentleman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. There's some bad allergies out there. There's an allergy to peanuts. There's allergies to pollen. But the single most dangerous allergy in America today is the Republican allergy to science. Because when you have an allergy to science, you don't just get the hives, you get the Republican Dirty Air Act. And that's what this is. Because that's what we're going to get because of this bill, is dirty air. Now, Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake. The Republicans are telling our kids with asthma, let them eat your inhalers. Because that's what they're saying to the kids with asthma today. We have unalloyed, uncontested consensus science that says that if we allow these gases to continue to pollute our atmosphere, our kids are going to get more asthma. And that is uncontested. Nobody the Republicans could produce in America would say that is not true. So since when was it an American policy to crawl into your beds and ignore a problem? This bill leaves our kids naked to health problems. And since when is it the right thing to do to tell the federal government it can't protect its citizens? I hear a lot of Republicans griping about waste, fraud, and abuse. This is the most abusive thing I've seen because it's telling the American public that their officials cannot enforce the law in the Clean Air Act, reject the Dirty Air Act.
Who seeks recognition on our side? Mr. Scalise, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Energy Tax Prevention Act, and we've heard from the EPA administrator, EPA is trying to impose an energy tax through de facto radical regulations. This Congress defeated, over in the Senate, defeated cap and trade, which was an energy tax that the President himself bragged would actually lead to skyrocketing electricity rates under cap and trade. Now, the EPA administrator went further to brag that her regulations would actually be worse than cap and trade in terms of increasing energy prices. And so if you look, the President's bragging that he's going to raise electricity prices with cap and trade. The EPA administrator herself bragged that if you don't pass cap and trade, her regulations would be even worse to consumers in terms of higher gas prices, higher energy prices. I think people get it. This is a jobs bill. We need to make sure that the EPA doesn't get away with these radical regulations that will run millions more jobs out of our country, will lead to even higher gas prices by their own admission. And I think it's time we do something in this Congress to help start creating jobs and creating an atmosphere where the science is not settled, as we heard from the scientists, but we do know from everybody that's testified that gas prices would go up if EPA gets away with this radical regulation. We need to create good jobs. We need to pass the Energy Tax Prevention Act. And I yield back.
Mr. Matheson, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just during my 1 minute, I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts. I filed 2 amendments. I'm actually not going to call them up today, but I want to get these amendments out there to get some discussion going on 2 points of view. The first, I think we need to take a look at whether or not it makes sense to really be repealing the greenhouse gas reporting rule. I think that data is good to collect. A lot of the utilities are already collecting it. I understand some of the concerns within the Agriculture Committee and some smaller manufacturers. I'm certainly open to adjustments to the amendment that I filed, but I question the wisdom of us withdrawing the reporting rule when I don't think it's a cost burden. I think having that data would be helpful for all of us to see. Second amendment I filed has to do actually not with greenhouse gas emissions, but all the other rulemaking that's going on at EPA right now, and I feel every one of those processes is being done in its own silo. And my amendment calls for EPA to harmonize that whole process, analyze how all those rules are going to fit together, the timing in which they're all going to come out, and do a cost-benefit analysis or cost analysis of the impact of all of those different rules coming through. These are the rules that collectively some call the train wreck that's approaching. And as much as we're talking today about greenhouse gases, I think if we're going to talk about EPA and Clean Air Act regulations, I think, again, it would be very informative for all of us to have an analysis of how all those different processes will fit together. I'll yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Matheson. We look forward to exploring that with you. I would note that this legislation does not repeal the 1990 reporting requirement of the utilities, but we look forward to discussing that with you. Any further? The gentleman from Kansas for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple letters of support from the National Association of Realtors, the American Farm Bureau, and the National Association of Manufacturers. I'd like to enter in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. You know, until 67 days ago, I was out there running a small business. I left that to come be part of a Congress that was going to allow small business to continue to succeed and grow jobs. And I'm happy that this morning this committee is marking up a bill that will do just that. Just yesterday, I had a chance to talk with some folks from CVR Energy, who operates a refinery in my district. I hold before you the reporting rule that was created for greenhouse gases. When I hear others talk about it being simple and modest, I'd ask anybody out there to read this and ask if they think this is either modest or certainly not simple. I think this is an enormous step forward. This week, EPA announced that the March 31st deadline for implementing this registry has now been moved back because they've got enormous challenges with it. I think this is a great step forward in making sure that gas prices in Kansas City, which CVR Energy provides 30% of the gasoline for, would go up enormously if we don't take this action. And I look forward to the markup today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Who seeks recognition? The gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And may I ask unanimous consent, please, to have 2 letters entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. One is from the American Lung Association and the other, the American Public Health Association, both strongly opposed to H.R. 910. The public wants us focused on job creation, Mr. Chairman, but apparently the leadership of the House and this committee isn't listening. They're focused on pushing a dangerous bill that would block the EPA from doing its job, which is to protect our health. It's not surprising that our nation's biggest polluters have asked for this bill. It lets them keep polluting our air. But what is surprising is that with this bill, Mr. Chairman, you've rejected the scientific consensus agreed to even by George W. Bush's EPA that carbon pollution threatens our national security, our economy, and our environment. H.R. 910 will not create one job. It will not foster a single economic advancement for our nation. Instead, it would increase the pollution that triggers asthma attacks, respiratory illnesses, and premature deaths. It would hobble American efforts to compete in the global energy marketplace. Peeling away public health protections would make life easier for polluters, but much harder for everyday Americans. Now's the time to preserve the Clean Air Act, protect our families from these deadly toxins, end our addiction to oil, and lower gas prices, save our economy billions of dollars every year. It's a long time that we address the serious issue, Mr. Chairman, so I urge my colleagues to abandon this divisive effort, turn back its focus to the issue of job creation. I yield back.
Thank you very much. This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas for his opening statement.
Thank you. And it's 1 minute, is that right?
1 minute. 1 minute, yes.
Okay. First, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for introducing this legislation. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor. Glad to see our witnesses. They look strangely like committee staff, but I guess that's because it's a markup. H.R. 910 is a logical response to environmental overkill. We all know that CO2 is a naturally occurring compound. We all know that it's necessary for life. And the majority of us know that it's not a pollutant in any normal definition of the sense, and that the EPA has been on a mission of political correctness and has tried to regulate something that shouldn't be regulated. The Clean Air Act was never intended to be relevant to something like CO2, and this bill is simply stating that the Clean Air Act does not apply to CO2, and it also says that the endangerment finding is without merit and shouldn't be enforced. I think it's a good piece of legislation, and I'm very glad to be an original co-sponsor. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from New York, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The majority claims that today's markup is designed to stop the EPA from, in their own words, driving up gasoline and energy prices and harming job creation. That statement ignores the science, ignores the facts, ignores the cost of inaction. What this legislation really does is bow down to the nation's largest polluters at great expense to our public health, energy security, and long-time economic prosperity. If indeed it hurts jobs, and I don't believe it does, what we should be doing is trying to find a balance, but not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. This is an extreme piece of legislation. Scientists from across the globe have stated in the strongest possible terms that the climate is changing and that human activity is to blame, and instead of acknowledging and addressing this reality, my colleagues attack the EPA and the Clean Air Act as job-killing villains. The facts betray them. Since its adoption, the Clean Air Act has reduced key air pollutants by 60%, while at the same time the economy has grown by over 200%. The benefits are real and they are measurable. The legislation before us today will quite simply block the EPA from doing its job to the grave detriment of ordinary Americans. I urge a no vote.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, as somebody that worked 10 years on the Air Board, 6 years on the Air Resources Board, are we talking about the same bill? This isn't talking about killing the Clean Air Act. It's about the Clean Air Act being hijacked for another agenda that the Clean Air Act was never meant to address. We're not talking about a toxic emission, and we're not talking about just the cost of doing it, but I'm asking as an air regulator from history, what are we getting for the cost of the economy? There is no one in the EPA that can look us in the face and say, if we are allowed to implement everything we're proposing, we will avoid climate change. Nobody is saying that. So the question is, we know the cost, we know the projected price tag, but where is the benefit that is being promised here? I challenge anybody to be able to stand up and say, if EPA implements what they're implementing within the decade, climate change will be addressed. We won't have to worry about mitigation. That is not able to be said, and you know we're all saying it. What's happened is we are actually taking CO2 and trying to say that it is a major toxic pollution or a pollution. That's a precursor for ozone, and that's minuscule compared to a lot of other precursors. Why aren't we going after methane and a lot of other precursors to ozone? Because there is an agenda here that is now trying to use the Clean Air Act to move an agenda that they're not willing to admit we need to address as a separate item, not by trying to hijack a bill that was specifically designed to protecting the health care in certain air districts, not the world climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbray. Who's the gentleman from Texas recognized for 1 minute?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm opposed to the EPA moving forward with the greenhouse gas regulations on large utilities and refineries in our country because I believe it's Congress should be making the decision on carbon control issues. We cannot simply discount the Supreme Court decision and say climate change is an issue and move on with it. What happens when last year's cap and trade bill, the Senate sat on this legislation for a year and then decides they do not have the votes to pass it? What happens when the President vetoes this legislation and the votes don't exist in either chamber to override the veto? Well, I can tell you what will happen. Industry across the country will still not have the regulatory certainty they need to invest and plan for the future. So I ask my colleagues on the other side to provide leadership. Let's address carbon so we don't have to worry about what the EPA is doing and whether they will be sued by outside groups to regulate the industries or move ahead with announcing dates of rulemaking. I believe a solution can be found for controlling carbon emissions by using more nuclear and natural gas to generate electricity. Nuclear power and natural gas are two sources that enjoy a lot of support within the majority, and I look forward, after this bill doesn't move anywhere, to begin addressing carbon by going for long-term nuclear expansion, but also short-term natural gas expansion. And I yield back my time.
Thank you. At this time, recognize the gentleman from West Virginia for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation is important, critically important to my home state of West Virginia, where the EPA continues their relentless and ill-conceived war on coal. Our state not only has a 10.3% unemployment rate, but the average price of gasoline is now $3.56 and climbing. Due in large part to the EPA's excessive regulations, West Virginia is now down to 50,000 manufacturing jobs when it used to have hundreds of thousands. Our steel industry once was robust, but is now desecrated. And now the EPA is ideologically motivated to crush the steel industry, raise energy prices, and the cost as many as 1.4 million jobs in America. This legislation isn't a partisan issue in West Virginia, but simply standing up for what's right. The entire delegation, both Democrats and Republicans, are standing alike, shoulder to shoulder, supporting legislation to stop the EPA's catastrophic assault on America through the greenhouse gas regulations. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to a bill that repeals the scientific finding that pollution is harming our people and our planet. However, I won't rise physically because I'm worried that the Republicans will overturn the law of gravity, sending us floating around the room. I won't call for the sunlight of additional hearings for fear that Republicans might excommunicate the finding that the Earth revolves around the sun. Instead, we will embody Newton's third law of motion and be an equal and opposing force against this attack on science and on laws that will reduce America's importation of foreign oil. This bill will live in the House while simultaneously being dead in the Senate. It will be a legislative Schrodinger's cat killed by the quantum mechanics of the legislative process. Arbitrary rejection of scientific fact will not cause us to rise from our seats today. But with this bill, pollution levels will rise. Oil imports will rise. Temperatures will rise. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. That is, unless a rejection of Einstein's special theory of relativity is somewhere in the chair's amendment pile.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Anyone seek gentleman from Texas for 1 minute?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for scheduling this markup today. This legislation will eliminate oppressive government regulations and create American jobs. Regulation of greenhouse gases is a de facto tax on energy. As our country nears record gas prices, up 22 cents in the past week, the largest increase since Hurricane Katrina. The EPA's greenhouse gas regulations only serve to increase the price of the pump for every American. The bill we consider today repeals the actions that the EPA has already taken to usurp state authority in my home state of Texas. America needs a comprehensive energy plan, all of the above, that provides affordable, reliable energy for our nation. This legislation will provide the certainty desperately needed by the private sector to grow jobs and get our economy back on track. I thank the chairman and look forward to moving this legislation.
Thank you very much. Anyone else on our side of the aisle would like to make an opening statement? Well, I think we've completed all the opening statements, and the chair at this time will call up H.R. 910 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 910.
Without objection, I would ask that the first reading be dispensed with, and at this time the bill would be open for amendment at any point. Does anyone seek, gentleman from California is recognized.
Word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I have 2 points I want to make. First of all, I want to, for the record, to put in an article entitled EPA Likely to Declare CO2 a Dangerous Pollutant. And my Republican friends have been quoting Lisa Jackson as saying that this rule would be the most expensive way to accomplish the goals that she seeks to achieve. And that was a number of years ago, and it was not timely, considering that the rule that she's proposing is a tailoring rule, which would be a lot less expensive. Just that for the record.
Without objection.
Now, I want to make a legal observation, because if you look at the bill is drafted in a way that says the administration may not promulgate any regulations concerning or take action relating to or take into consideration the emission of greenhouse gas to address climate change. That's the first premise. But then there's an exception. The exception says that notwithstanding that provision, which I just read, that this won't affect light-duty greenhouse gas emission standards and corporate average fuel economy standards. So the argument is that we're not going to overturn the vehicle rules that are now in effect. But I would suggest that that's not an accurate reading of the law, because the law ignores what is already in the Clean Air Act, Section 202A, which premises any standards applicable to the emissions of any air pollutant from any class or classes of new motor vehicles must reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. So the law says you can't adopt a motor vehicle standard unless there's an endangerment finding. But the bill repeals the endangerment finding. So we say that EPA cannot act to do anything in this area except for motor vehicles, but saying we accept motor vehicles means nothing because the underlying law requires an endangerment finding. Now, why is this important? In 2009, the Obama administration brokered an agreement to provide the auto industry with one national program for fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions. Under that agreement, the DOT, the EPA, committed to promulgate 2012 to 2016 model year fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards that align with one another. And my state of California agreed that all manufacturers that comply with the EPA greenhouse gas rule during this period would be deemed to be in compliance with the standards adopted by California. This was a provision adopted and supported by the auto industry, the states, and the environmental advocacy groups. It means that over the lifetime of the vehicles sold during 2012 to 2016, this national program is projected to save 1.8 billion barrels of oil. EPA and DOT estimate that the standard yields average net savings to consumers of roughly $3,000 over the life of the vehicle. This is a widely heralded provision. It has made us less dependent on oil. The projections are that we're going to have less need for foreign oil because we are going to be using less oil because oil is primarily used for motor vehicles. And that's why the drafters of this bill have tried to make us believe that they're not going to change this. But in fact, they do change it, because when they repeal the endangerment finding, it in effect takes away the ability to deal in this area. The exception doesn't address the issue of whether those standards can survive legal challenge without the endangerment finding, and I would submit that what we're doing is going to endanger not the EPA, but endanger the ability of the EPA to continue with this consensus standard that reducing our dependence on foreign oil and reducing carbon pollution from cars would be accomplished as was agreed by everybody involved, except for, I suppose, the oil companies who don't want to lose out on their market share of oil they could sell for vehicles that would use more miles per gallon. This is an extreme bill. It takes us exactly in the wrong direction. I wanted to make this point. I wanted to underscore it. And I think anybody who would read this carefully will see the argument that I'm making. In fact, Mr. Chairman, in the submission that we made part of the record from our staff, it outlines more clearly than I might have in this oral presentation why this bill goes far beyond what we've been told it does.
Well, I want to thank the gentleman for bringing that to our attention. I will say that we went to great lengths to set out various exceptions in this bill, including protecting the light-duty vehicle greenhouse gas emission standard, as well as the renewable fuel standard, as well as any studies that are underway in the federal government relating to greenhouse gases, as well as protecting the Montreal Protocol, as well as protecting the reporting requirements as required in the 1990 amendments relating utility emissions. And I would ask our General Counsel if she would want to address the point that Mr. Waxman made.
Mr. Chairman, could we run the clock, and then I want you to yield to me to follow up with questions of the Council on that point.
I'm sorry, what was your point again?
I just wanted to be sure that if you're using your time now to rebut, that we keep track of that time, and then at some point I'm going to ask to
Sure.
further.
Yeah, I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and now, Ms. Brown, if you would like to respond.
On the specific question of whether or not the auto rule is preserved, it's the position of the authors of this bill that it is preserved for two reasons. First of all, the NHTSA authority with respect to fuel economy does not rely on the endangerment findings, so fuel efficiency requirements of NHTSA remain, and so notwithstanding your argument, then there would still be that regulation for fuel efficiency. But as a second matter, because of that clause that says notwithstanding the fact that the endangerment finding is repealed, and then the auto rule is preserved, it's almost as though it has the effect of Congress codifying the auto rule, that the prerequisite for agency action, which is that initial endangerment finding, is no longer needed because Congress itself made is setting that as the rule, that the auto rule is the law of the land.
And that certainly was our intent, to protect that light-duty vehicle greenhouse gas emission standard that was agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, will you yield to me?
I will yield to the gentleman.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, because there are two organizations that have to do with the fuel efficiency standards. One is NHTSA and the other is EPA. Without this EPA rule, which you seem to suggest in your answer would not apply because of the underlying code, or certainly that I submit would not, that would mean we'd get 30% less reductions than NHTSA can accomplish. We may want to deny the science. We may want to deny the wording of the statute. But I would submit, despite your good intentions, you don't accomplish what you say you're accomplishing. And I put that out there, and anybody who wants to look at the statute and follow our argument, they can see the case that we're making, which I think is a strong case. And if it's not strong enough to convince you, it may well be strong enough to convince a court.
Would the gentleman? I would. Ms. Brown, did you want to make another comment on this? Okay. I will yield time to the gentleman from
Mr. Chairman, in due respect to the gentleman from California, what has happened here chronologically is Congress passed in '07 a CAFE bill that the President then, with cooperation of the EPA, altered without congressional approval. This bill is actually legitimizing in statute what the President did. I would submit, Mr. Waxman, that this gives the EPA its legal basis from any outside suits now. So I say the opposite is true in my legal analysis. I yield back.
I yield back my time, and anyone have the gentleman? For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I just want to point out that I think that this law will fail for 3 reasons, because there are 3 laws that the Congress cannot repeal. The Congress cannot repeal, despite the Republicans' efforts, the first law of thermodynamics. You cannot repeal the physical law of the conservation of energy. And we have uncontested evidence that right now, because of these pollutions, we are changing the climate and endangering our children's health. And despite the Republicans' best effort, you can't pull down some sort of veil of scientific ignorance and repeal the first law of thermodynamics. You can't do it. So this bill essentially asks America to crawl under our bed and ignore this looming threat to our health and our climate. And I just think this country is greater than that. I think this country can do what it is doing right now in Detroit and across this country, which is designing new ways for us to get around in cars that burn a lot less oil or don't use oil. And that brings me to the second point. The Republicans, neither Republicans nor the Congress, nor a bipartisan effort can repeal the law of supply and demand. And if you read an interesting book, and I would commend it to everyone here, called Your World is About to Get Much Smaller. It's by an energy economist named Jeff Rubin. And he points out that there are 2 immutable facts. That even if we drill on the Capitol Mall and in Yellowstone National Park, we don't have enough oil to have an appreciable impact on the price of oil, because the oil production in the world is plateaued. It is not going to go up, and it is probably going to go down. But another thing is happening. Demand is skyrocketing because of the burgeoning economies in China and India and the rest of the world. Now, as this book will point out, and I think you'll find it of interest, the law of supply and demand means that as long as the United States is addicted to oil in our transportation fleet, we are exposed to these price increases that our constituents are justifiably now very concerned about. And I heard a lot of my Republican colleagues talking about concern about oil. But there's one immutable law you can't repeal. The law of supply and demand says, as long as that's what we're burning, we're going to be exposed to these price hikes. Now, I would hope that at some point we get together on a bipartisan basis to help the business people that are now helping us break that addiction. The business people like General Motors, who've done the General Motors Volt, which is a great car that goes 40 miles on pure electricity. And if you want to go further, you use gasoline. We ought to be working on a bipartisan basis to find ways to help businesses move forward that kind of innovation. And I'm afraid that my Republican colleagues can't get over their fear that we can't innovate out of our way out of this problem. And if you'll talk to businesses around the country, you'll see people all around the country innovating our way out of this problem. And when we try to repeal the first law of thermodynamics and law of supply and demand, we don't help those businesses move forward.
Gentleman yield.
Sure.
I would just point out to the gentleman that in prior energy bills that were passed in a bipartisan manner, we actually invested in hydrogen fuel cell development. We invested in battery development, and we're for that. But the supply and demand curve also says you got to do something about supply as we move to these new technologies.
And I agree with that wholeheartedly. The point I want to make is if we're going to reduce the impact of this straitjacket we're in, we're going to have to develop whole new systems of energy above and beyond petrochemicals. And we're going to have to, I'm for increasing supplies of petrochemicals as well. My concern about this approach, however, is that it takes our foot off the gas pedal of innovation. Because when you repeal the ability of the federal government to protect Americans of asthma, you simultaneously reduce the incentives to make investments in these additional new technologies to provide us a way out of this addiction. And this is why I believe this is a pro-China development bill that we have here today. The Chinese are not sleeping. They are developing these technologies. The Germans are not sleeping. They are developing these technologies. But when we do this today, we're reducing the incentive to make investments in these clean energy technologies. That's why I think it is a job killer over the long run for us, and it's one of the reasons I'm not supporting the bill. And I just hope that someday we'll get together and find a way to help these businesses move forward. Thank you. I yield back.
I would remind the members also that we do have, we're open now for amendments. Does any member have an amendment to this bill? All right. If we have no further amendments, the question now occurs on favorably. Yes. Yes, ma'am. For what purpose does the lady from California seek recognition?
To speak the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
When you ask for more amendments, I don't have an amendment, but I do have a couple of questions for counsel, if you don't mind.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
The Upton-Inhofe bill changes the manner in which motor vehicles have been regulated in the United States for over 40 years. The Clean Air Act has authorized 2 sets of standards to control tailpipe pollution from motor vehicles. Federal standards and the standards established by California, which can also be and have been adopted by other states. And this is my question for counsel. The Upton-Inhofe bill would terminate both federal and state authority to establish tailpipe standards for greenhouse gas emissions after vehicle model year 2016. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct.
Okay. And let me just state for the record that Section 209B of the Clean Air Act requires EPA to waive federal preemption for California motor vehicle standards if the agency determines that California's standards in the aggregate will be at least as protective of public health and welfare as federal standards. It also provides that other states have the option of electing to apply California standards. In practice, this has allowed California to set vehicle standards that are more protective of public health than the federal standards, and it allows other states to follow California's example if they choose. This is another then my question to repeat. Council Section 3 of the Upton-Inhofe bill strips the EPA of its authority to waive federal preemption, thereby blocking any state tailpipe standards for greenhouse gases for model year 2017 or later. Does it not?
Yes, that is correct.
Council, do you know where California's special authority to set its own motor vehicle standards originated? Well, this authority was part of the Air Quality Act of 1967 and was retained when Congress adopted the original 1970 Clean Air Act. This authority was expanded in the 1977 amendments, with Congress recognizing that the underlying intent of Section 209 is to afford California the broadest possible discretion in selecting the best means to protect the health of its citizens and the public welfare. For over 40 years, this authority has served the nation well. It has allowed states to drive improvements in the federal standards. Without this state authority, cars would emit more pollution, use more oil, and cost more to fill up at the pump. Republicans talk about the need to reduce gasoline prices, but this bill would have the opposite effect. It would increase demand for gasoline, increase our dependence upon foreign oil, and increase gasoline prices. It's exactly the wrong approach. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. And I might say that on that point, it is true that this bill takes away that waiver, but what historically has happened is that California has been setting these very, very high standards, and automobiles are sold in interstate commerce, so they're requiring other states to abide by those same laws, and we feel like it is not right that California should be dictating standards for the rest of the country.
Gentlemen, yield. Chairman, yield to me.
I would.
California wishes to speak on this point.
I'm not going to yield at this time because there are other members who want to speak, but I would remind everyone they have the right to seek recognition and strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose the gentleman?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, a little quick history on this, and I'm sure that the gentleman from the great community of Los Angeles and the Santa Monica will point this out. The reason why California had exemptions is that the federal standards could not bring us to attainment in our non-attainment areas, that California's problem was so bad that we needed to use extraordinary efforts and be given the authority to make those efforts to lower the emissions down to the safe standards that were required under the Act. So we had to have more tools to accomplish the goal in California than other places did. And I think that the one thing, let me clarify something, but the one thing that is not being talked about now is that there is no need for California to reduce its emissions of CO2 any more than anywhere else in the country or the world if we're going to reach a certain standard, unless the assumption is that you expect California to basically make up for the fact that China and third world countries and a lot of places are not going to emit at all. But the reason why we were given the waiver is we could not fulfill the standard for our air basins without doing more and having than what the rest of the country was doing, and it was specifically based on protecting the health within those air basins where the air quality was documented to be a public threat and was documented to be more severe than other air basins. Thus, the latitude or the regulations had to go beyond what the state standards were, and that is why we were given the regulation, because it said, federal government, if you require us to come to this standard, then you've got to allow us to use other tools than what the rest of the country's using. I yield back.
The gentleman yield to me.
He yielded back his
well,
time.
The gentleman still has 3 minutes, and I wonder if the gentleman from California would yield to me, because
he yielded back his time. But
well, he's trying to yield to me, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yielded his time. But if
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Who's saying the last word?
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield to the ranking member.
I thank you for yielding to me, and I'm sort of taken aback by the lack of consideration to clarify this point. The gentleman from California, from the great county of San Diego, is absolutely right. California was always able, since 1970, when the Clean Air Act was adopted, to set its own standard for automobiles. California is 10% of the market in the country. California, in setting its own standards, drove the automobile industry to recognize that it could meet those standards. These were for the criterion pollutants, and it certainly affected whether we could come into attainment. But California has a very aggressive law on CO2, not just in autos, but in other areas as well. And the chairman said he doesn't see why California ought to have this ability. Well, we in California think we ought to have this ability. And I say we, I'm speaking for myself, the legislature, and our former Governor Schwarzenegger, who supported the legislation in California to be more aggressive than the rest of the country. I just wanted to point this out. I know that maybe the chairman didn't want me to point this out. I don't know why. It's, I think, a legitimate part of the debate. But this bill repeals California's ability to set tighter standards in the future. In fact, it even repeals EPA's ability to set tighter automobile standards under the terms of the bill itself, where they thought in drafting it they were exempting the existing existing national standard for automobiles. I don't think they did, but they say that the EPA cannot set a tighter standard than the existing standard. Talk about, Mr. Chairman, the view that I hear over and over again from the other side of the aisle, that we ought to let local governments make decisions. They're closer to the people. Everything should be resolved, I hear, in Washington. We don't have all the wisdom in the world. I just think that the people ought to understand that this is what is happening under this.
The gentleman yield?
Yes, certainly.
Look, I understand that, but I'm sure the gentleman will point out the big difference we have was the fact that we got a waiver from the interstate commerce because the federal government was putting a mandate on California that California could not fulfill under the federal program. And thus, we got a waiver from that because they were unique. You had to reduce emissions much more than the rest of the country to be able to reach those standards. When it comes to CO2 and climate change, I'm sure you all understand that is not the reality there. California should be reducing
my
the same amount.
time. It is a reality in California. We have suffered from very severe weather conditions. We have a unique problem, not just to smog, but to CO2 emissions. And in the state of California, the legislature decided they wanted to deal with this problem. And now the Washingtonians here, supported by the Republican side of the aisle, want to tell California they can't deal with their own problems. I yield back the balance of my time.
I recognize myself 5 minutes. I might say, first of all, that I certainly do not.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
How many times can we recognize you?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike last word.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5
I yield my time to the chairman.
Thank you. I was simply going to say that we don't want to stifle any debate here. There are a lot of people who have not stricken the last word, and they can always yield their time. I would make one other comment on the California issue, that this waiver relates only to the greenhouse gas issue and no others. So I would yield back to the...
With the gentleman yield.
The gentleman from Illinois
I'd be happy
controls
to
the
yield
time.
to my colleague from California.
I want the committee to know, too, as a Californian, I'm ashamed that a state that claims to be leading the charge on CO2 emissions still has an abolition against nuclear power, when anyone who's looking at this understands what an irresponsible action that is when you get into it. I have not introduced an amendment to specifically address that issue in this bill, but I think it's one that if we're really going to seriously talk about it, and let me remind you, the UN Council on Climate Change, who got the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore, specifically identified nuclear as an essential part of the strategy. And for our state, who's always been a leader on this, to still be locked into a 1970s model when there is science has told us much, not only there's a climate issue, but also that nuclear is an essential part of that. That was something we need to address, but that's the kind of things that we need to be moving forward to. And I think that we still come back to this issue. California's responsibility to reduce climate change is the same as everyone else in the world. And California reducing 1% more than anybody else is not going to change this issue. And that is totally different than what happened when we were talking about ozone, when we were talking toxic emissions, when we were talking bring our air basins into compliance. It was totally different than what we're talking about when we talk about climate change. And I yield back to the gentleman.
And I would just end by good sides, we're going to disagree on this. Republicans believe that greenhouse gases are not a criteria pollutant. The EPA should not regulate it. And if they do, in doing so, they will raise energy costs, which will hurt jobs. The other side wants to regulate greenhouse gases, wants to increase energy costs, which will attack jobs. I mean, that's the debate, and we'll say it a lot of different ways, but when you boil it down to that's the issue, we'll eventually move and have a vote in this committee. It'll go to the full committee. It'll go to the floor. I guarantee you it will pass on the floor. And as much as my colleagues want to say what the Senate will or will not do and what the President will or will not do, we want to give them the opportunity to weigh in on this decision. I yield back my time.
The gentleman for what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being so fair. I appreciate it. I'd like to ask the Council something, if I might. Protecting public health and preventing climate change should not be a partisan issue. In fact, it was the Bush administration that began laying the foundation for EPA's reasonable carbon pollution requirements. So I'd like to ask the Council, on May 14, 2007, President Bush signed an executive order making it the policy of the United States for the Department of Transportation and EPA to exercise in a coordinated fashion their statutory authorities to protect the environment from greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. Isn't that correct?
2007 executive order?
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat the date, the executive order?
May 14, 2007. It was making it the policy of the U.S. for EPA to exercise in a coordinated fashion, along with the DOT, their statutory authorities to protect the environment from greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles.
Mr. Ingold, may we have a copy of the executive order?
Yes.
Would one of you come up and get that? And
Certainly. Okay. I'm happy to submit it to the record. I have it right here, and I'm happy
without objection.
submit it.
Thank you. We'll have the council look at this.
I'd like to also ask the council, on July 11th, 2008, the Bush administration EPA issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that sought public comment on whether an endangerment finding should be issued and how greenhouse gases should be regulated under the Clean Air Act. Is that correct?
Could you repeat the question?
On July 11th, 2008, the Bush administration EPA issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that sought public comment on whether an endangerment finding should be issued and how greenhouse gases should be regulated under the Clean Air Act.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Admittedly, this was a timid response to the Supreme Court's decision in Massachusetts versus EPA that greenhouse gases are air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. But the Bush administration EPA actually believed that an endangerment finding was required by the science. In January 2008, Stephen Johnson, the former EPA administrator, sent a private letter to President Bush. Administrator Johnson wrote, quote, "The latest science of climate change requires the agency to create a positive endangerment finding. It does not permit a credible finding that we need to wait for more research," unquote. And he said that the Bush cabinet agreed with this position. Now, the science hasn't changed in the last 2 years. In fact, it's only gotten stronger. And let me also quote from Administrator Johnson. He wrote to President Bush, quote, "A robust interagency policy process involving principal meetings over the past 8 months has enabled me to formulate a plan that is prudent and cautious, yet forward-thinking. It creates a framework for responsible, cost-effective, and practical actions," unquote. He added that actions to reduce carbon emissions, quote, "should spur both private sector investment in developing new, cost-effective technologies and private sector deployment of these technologies at a large scale," unquote. So the steps that EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson is proposing under the Clean Air Act are moderate and appropriate. They're also remarkably similar to the measures that former Administrator Johnson recommended to President Bush. As Administrator Johnson's letter makes clear, EPA under both Republican and Democratic administrations has had the same view of the science. Carbon emissions are definitely a serious threat to our nation's welfare. I would like to also say that on December 15th, 2009, EPA Administrator Jackson issued a scientific determination that greenhouse gases threaten public health and welfare. This is commonly referred to as the endangerment finding. Council, I'd like to ask you, is there any Energy and Commerce Committee precedent for legislatively repealing an agency's scientific determination?
Well, there's certainly precedent for repealing rulemakings, but there is no precedent for EPA doing an endangerment finding as a standalone that we were able to find. So EPA's action to unilaterally move an endangerment finding without it being attached to a rulemaking was unprecedented, and it would be unprecedented for Congress to overturn that.
Well, I thank you, because I'm not aware of such a precedent either. I believe this will be the first time that our committee will substitute its scientific views for those of an expert agency. And I think it would be an act of striking arrogance for a group of politicians to overturn a scientific determination made by an agency based on the work of thousands of expert scientists. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I might make a comment that after Mr. Johnson wrote that memo, he did in fact say that he did not believe that the Clean Air Act was the appropriate vehicle to regulate greenhouse gases. Does anyone else seek recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Just strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Quick question for counsel. Can you confirm for me that the underlying legislation removes EPA's authority to move forward with any future regulations that will have the effect of curbing oil use from cars or trucks?
It prohibits any future rulemakings for addressing greenhouse gases with respect to climate change. So
And that will have
specific to the
and that will have the effect of curbing future regulations to reduce oil use from cars or trucks. Is that correct?
EPA has a consulting role with respect to CAFE standards with NHTSA, so they would continue to have a role with respect to fuel efficiency. To the
In
extent
fact,
that relates to fuel consumption and oil.
well, some have maintained that it is fine to do away with that authority because the Department of Transportation can continue to set fuel economy standards. But according to both EPA and the Department of Transportation, there is a 30% more, a greater reduction in oil consumption using EPA's greenhouse gas tailpipe standards than the Department of Transportation's fuel economy standards. Is that correct? Because let me just because the EPA can require improvements in air conditioning efficiency and flex fuel vehicle credits, and NHTSA cannot do that. Is that correct?
It is, but notice that that is no longer oil. And your question, I thought, was about oil.
Well, it is about oil because air conditioning obviously causes the vehicle to have to consume more oil in order to maintain both the capacity to drive and to stay cool at the same time. Is that not correct?
It is correct that there is a relationship between air conditioning
Thank you.
loads and fuel.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the EPA standards save 30% more oil than DOT's because EPA can look at air conditioning, look at flex fuel issues as well, which the Department of Transportation does not. Now, EPA has announced plans for the next set of standards for cars and trucks, and right now, the EPA, as this legislation passes, it would result in 700,000 fewer barrels per day, less oil than we otherwise would have consumed. Let's move on to other uses of oil. Airplanes use about 1.2 million barrels of oil per day. Large boats use about 580,000 barrels of oil per day. Trains use about 277,000 barrels of oil per day. Can you confirm for me that the underlying legislation removes EPA's authority to move forward with regulations to curb greenhouse gas emissions from oil use in airplanes, large boats, trains, and other large transportation sources like construction vehicles?
Yes, for greenhouse gases to address climate change through the Clean Air Act, yes.
Thank you. So they won't have the authority to reduce the amount of oil that is consumed in those modes of transportation. Does the Department of Transportation have the authority to reduce oil use from any of those sources?
I'm sorry?
Does the Department of Transportation have any authority to reduce oil consumption in any of those areas?
Not that I'm aware.
No, the answer is no, they do not. Industrial and commercial facilities use almost 4.5 million barrels of oil per day, almost 25% of our daily use. Even if you assume that EPA could only reduce demand for 20% of that oil by 2030, we're still talking about 900,000 barrels per day. Can you confirm for me that the underlying legislation removes EPA's authority to move forward with regulations to curb greenhouse gas emissions from oil used by any of those facilities?
It would take away the authority for greenhouse gas emissions for
It would remove the authority to reduce oil consumption from any of those areas. Thank you so much, Counsel. Now, does the Department of Transportation have the authority to reduce oil from any of those sources?
Department of Transportation is transportation sources, not stationary.
They do not have the authority. That is correct. So the Republicans are saying that their bill is going to reduce gas prices. Well, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that because of their bill, we will have to import upwards of 3.2 million barrels per day at $100 a barrel than we otherwise would have. if the EPA was able to maintain this authority and to promulgate regulations. And I think at this time, as we watch Libya and we watch Tunisia and we watch Egypt, we see Saudi Arabia and Bahrain try to bribe their people not to overturn their governments, to engage in this kind of activity, goes right at the heart of our national security. And I do not believe that we should be casting this vote at this particular point in time. It sends the wrong signal to our nation. The terrorists are the oil cartel. Okay, the hearing that they're having in Homeland Security right now is not nearly as much of a threat to our country as what this oil threat does in supplying the funding for the terrorists around the world. This is just not the right time or place. This bill is an historic.
Gentleman's time has expired. Anyone else seek recognition at this time? Gentleman from Michigan, for what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition? Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. When I saw the legislation before us today, I was very much impressed. I thought, my sly friend, Mr. Upton, has expanded the jurisdiction of this committee again. By golly, he's doing much better than I ever did.
We're trying our best.
I thought, well, when I get down there, I got to commend him for this. So, but then I started looking around in Black's Law Dictionary and to see what a tax is, and that says this: a monetary charge imposed by the government on persons, entities, transactions, or properties to yield a public revenue. In other words, it's a charge that produces revenues to fund the government. So I took and started looking around in the legislation. I thought, by golly, must be a tax in here. Where is it? So, Counsel, I couldn't find one. Can you tell me where there's a tax in this bill? Either a tax that's there or a tax that's repealed?
It is not a direct tax. It's a tax through regulation.
Okay. So there's no tax here. Now, the bill overturns EPA's scientific determination of greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare. Does that endangerment finding generate revenue for the taxpayers?
No, the endangerment finding is the trigger
now,
for regulations
Counsel,
that cost the taxpayer.
I need some more help here, and I only got 5 minutes. The bill expressly repeals EPA's 2009 greenhouse gas reporting rule, thus giving us valuable information ensuring that Congress can make informed decisions. Has that rule raised funds for the government?
No, I think it's the position of the...
Now, Counsel, the bill would bar EPA from issuing regulations to establish minimum technology-based emissions limits for the largest power plants and oil refineries. Do these emissions limits raise revenue for the government?
No, cost on consumers.
Thank you. None of the authorities and requirements then repealed by the bill are taxes. Is that right?
No, they're costs on consumers, not revenue raisers for
Now,
the government.
I note, and again, I want to salute my friend, Mr. Upton, because I thought, boy, that's a sly fella. He's really pulled something off. You know, I spent a long time looking after the jurisdiction of this committee. I thought, by golly, we got a chairman who's going to do the kind of things I used to love to do, but this bill has been referred to Energy and Commerce and not Ways and Means. That tells me, I think, that there's no taxes either in or prevented in this legislation. And I do want to say I've kind of pulled a leg of my friend, the chairman, and I've done it. I've tried to do it in good humor because I have enormous affection and respect for him. But I do think we do need a little truth in labeling here on this legislation. And if we're going to repeal taxes, we ought to do it or say it. And if we're not doing it, we ought not take credit for it, because I find that has the practical effect of making folks watch this committee. And I had to undergo that for a long time when the folks across the hall were always watching us, or Ways and Means was always watching us, because they thought I was trying to increase the jurisdiction of this committee. And I just warned my old friend that maybe this isn't such a good idea to be attracting that kind of unwanted attention, because those folks across the way can get a little bit unfriendly when these things happen.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course, to my good friend, yes.
I would note that our good friend, Mr. Camp, is a co-sponsor of the bill, so we have the support of some of those on Ways and Means, and we'd be delighted to add your name as a co-sponsor later in the day when the House goes into session.
I have told my good friend, and I really mean it, I'm very sympathetic to what he's trying to do, and I think this situation is a nasty mess, and we're pretty close to getting together, but we got a little further to go. So I do want to express my good wishes and affection for the gentleman, and thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield his remaining time.
I've got 35 seconds. I'll yield it to the gentleman.
Before we vote, I just want to read something that came across the wire about 10 minutes ago. This is from a NASA report. Quote, the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are losing mass at an accelerating pace according to a new NASA-funded satellite study. The findings of the study, the longest to date of changes in polar ice sheet mass, suggest these ice sheets are overtaking ice loss from Earth's mountain glaciers and ice cap to become the dominant contributor to global sea level rise much sooner than the model forecasts are predicted. The report goes on to say that our sea level rise will be 1 foot by 2050. And I think it's an interesting historic irony that 30 minutes after our NASA scientists tell us that we got a big, big problem, this great committee votes to do nothing about it. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman? I would for what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask counsel some questions so that we can get some clarification on exactly what's required under these new requirements for stationary sources. Counsel, only new sources or existing sources that expand and significantly increase emissions are currently subject to any requirement to control their greenhouse gas emissions, correct?
Yes, but new rulemakings that would also affect existing facilities are also underway, and as well as there's reporting requirements.
But that's correct. That statement's correct, right? Thank you.
No, but okay.
So let me ask you this. Let me take an example. If I operate a coal plant in Ohio that's already up and running, and I don't make any major modifications to it, I don't need a greenhouse gas PSD permit from EPA, do I?
Under rules that are forthcoming from EPA, they will be required for existing.
You're talking about Title V permits, that reporting requirements?
No, I'm talking about new source performance standards under 111.
Counsel, I don't know where you get this information. Last week, Mr. Barton asked this question to EPA Assistant Administrator for Air, and she confirmed that such a plant would not need a greenhouse gas permit. I understand that sources will have to address greenhouse gases in their Title V permits, but that's essentially a paperwork requirement. It doesn't trigger any actual control requirements. So let me ask you another thing. In May of 2010, EPA finalized a tailoring rule to limit permit review requirements to only the largest polluting facilities in the country. Counsel, under the tailoring rule, until June 30th, 2011, only sources subject to prevention of significant deterioration permitting requirements for other pollutants will be required to consider greenhouse gases in their permits. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And from July 1st, 2011 until June 30th, 2013, only new sources that emit at least 100,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year or existing sources seeking to increase pollution by at least 75,000 tons per year will be required to obtain a greenhouse gas permit, correct?
That's the requirement for PSD and Title V, but when the new source performance standard regulations are promulgated, which that'll be before that date, that'll affect
those aren't in effect. Those are not in effect yet, though.
They're in the process of.
They're not in effect, though. Thank you. And for the period after June 2013, EPA has said that it would not even consider applying greenhouse gas requirements to facilities that emit less than 50,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year, correct?
I think correct, but I didn't hear the full question. I'm sorry.
You want me to repeat it?
Sure.
After June 2013, EPA has said that it would not even consider applying greenhouse gas requirements to facilities that emit less than 50,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year.
Subject to reconsideration in 2016 about how to handle those smaller.
So what we're saying here is that a facility would have to emit carbon pollution equivalent to burning a rail car of coal every day to fall into the small pool of facilities that are required to comply with EPA's greenhouse gas requirements. We're not talking about farms or residences or commercial building. We're talking about huge, high-polluting facilities. Now let's turn the process for facilities, turn to the process for facilities that would have to comply with these regulations. New facilities with carbon pollution that would exceed the threshold in the tailoring rule will have to go through a technology review process to determine the best available control technology, the BACT, to limit carbon pollution at the facilities. In most of the country, this review is carried out by state or local permitting authorities, not by the EPA itself. Council, EPA has issued guidance to assist state and local permitting agencies with the BACT process. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the process begins with the state identifying all available technologies that might limit carbon pollution. Council, in its guidance, EPA stated that fuel switching would fundamentally redefine a source, such as switching from coal to natural gas, would not need to be considered as an option. Is that correct?
They said that states could require it as an option, but it would not be required at the federal level.
Thank you. For certain facilities, this initial list of available technologies could include carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. But the state then ranks the various options for limiting emissions and eliminates options that are too expensive or technically infeasible. Council, EPA's guidance stated that CCS would likely be eliminated as an option for BACT because of high cost, right?
There is no example of a commercial and economic CCS plant.
Well, that's certainly what we've seen so far. In New York, the Lafarge cement plant went through the process, and the state quickly eliminated CCS as technically infeasible because no geological formation existed close to the cement plant. And so the EPA confirmed New York's approach, and that was consistent with their guidance. Finally, after looking over the technical feasibility and cost, the state selected a technology that was required, and in the case of the Lafarge plant, the state determined that the cement plant could reduce its carbon pollution by 12% by installing several types of efficiency equipment. So in closing, I'd just like to say that the only thing that happened in the Lafarge thing is they made changes to energy efficiency and improvements, which ended up saving the company money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I understand the angst on the minority side. I've been there. It's a terrible thing to not have the votes and have to sit through these type of markups. And I certainly understand where Mr. Dingle was coming from, and Mr. Doyle was coming from, and Mr. Green was coming from, and even Mr. Inslee, where he's been coming from. But I think we need to point out a few basic facts. So I want to ask the council some questions too. Okay? Now, under current law, because of the endangerment finding, the EPA has the authority to set the greenhouse gas regulations. Is that not correct?
That is EPA's position.
That is EPA's position. Now, the EPA is trying to come across as some gentle-hearted, benign entity. So the tailoring rule, which several of my friends on the minority side have commented on, the tailoring rule simply says that EPA is not going to regulate everything that they could under the Clean Air Act. Is that not correct?
Not at this time, but they've reserved the right to regulate smaller sources down the line starting.
So just out of the goodness of their heart, the EPA has said, we're going to use this tailoring rule. Now, same thing Mr. Doyle was just asking about, CCS, carbon capture sequestration, and all these things. The EPA is saying, if you have a power plant and you don't change it, we're not going to make you do anything. Is that not correct?
At this time, but they haven't.
At this time.
At this time.
But if they wanted to, if they decided if we leave them alone, this EPA or the next EPA could, under the endangerment finding, come back and set those regulations, could they not?
Yes, and this EPA has actually already started that process to be able to regulate existing utilities with a new rulemaking.
And if they wanted to, they could set a regulatory emission standard so high that that particular power plant might have to shut down.
It's discretionary, yes.
It's discretionary. Now, if we pass this bill, and it passes the full committee, and it passes the House, and it passes the Senate, and the President signs it. Now, I know that's a lot of ifs, and my friends are starting to salivate, because when you finally get to the President, He only has one vote, and I don't think he'd vote with us today. I think he'd vote with my friend Mr. Dingell and Mr. Doyle. So I understand that when it gets to that point, they'll have the vote and we won't. But maybe by that time we can change the president's mind.
Gentlemen, yield.
I will in just a second. I will in just a second. But if we pass this bill and it becomes law, the EPA will have no discretionary authority on greenhouse gases. Is that not correct?
Correct, for addressing climate change.
So we don't have to rely on the goodwill of EPA in terms of greenhouse gases. They still have full authority under the Clean Air Act on the criteria of pollutants. Is that not correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I would tell my friends on the other side, folks on this side, we know that we have a new and warm and fuzzy friendly EPA. We understand that. But we're not sure that that's where they're always going to be. So we'd just as soon pass a law saying for greenhouse gases, the EPA has no authority, and just let that be the law. Now, I'll be happy to yield to my friend from California, Mr. Waxman.
I thank you for yielding. It seems to me that if we pass this, EPA can do nothing about this problem. No one else is doing anything about the problem. Congress could pass some legislation. We put forward a proposal, Mr. Markey and I, last year, and I asked you whether you'd want to work with us, and your response was, why do I want to work on solving a problem that I don't think exists?
That's exactly right.
Now, for those who do believe there is a problem that does exist and that the science is not being denied, we should work together to do something. But I would suggest that what we're going to accomplish today is to say nobody can do anything about this problem. And if the gentleman would permit, I'd like to put into the record an article from today's Washington Post about ice sheets melting faster than earlier estimates. And today, New York Times has said heat damages Columbia coffee, raising prices. I think there's a problem. And if we want to pretend there's no problem and say EPA can't act, Congress won't act, the problem will get even worse. So
I have no objection to those going into the record, and I thank the chairman.
Without objection, the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Mattson, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Move to strike the requisite number of words.
Recognized 5 minutes.
I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Rush.
Gentleman's recognized.
I want to thank the gentleman. I want to ask the Legislative Council some questions here. According to Chairman Upton, EPA's current and planned greenhouse gas requirements are virtually identical to the comprehensive energy and climate bill passed by the House in the last Congress. Do you agree with that?
In general, they're based on the same policy of trying to curb carbon emissions.
Chairman Upton has said that the purpose of this bill is to, quote, prevent EPA from imposing by regulation the massive cap and trade tax that Congress rejected last year. So let's see whether the greenhouse gas regulations in the House bill actually are the same or even in the same ballpark. For starters, the House bill implemented cap and trade to reduce carbon pollution. I want to ask the Council, do the prevention of significant deterioration or PSD permit requirements cap the total quantity of greenhouse gas emissions nationwide?
No, but other provisions of the Clean Air Act
Thank
do
you
allow
so much. Do the
cap and trade.
PSD permit requirements create tradable emissions allowances?
No, but other provisions
Thank you
of the
so
Clean
much.
Air Act can allow
The
for
existing clean air requirements for greenhouse gases are not a cap and trade program. They don't cap emissions, and they don't create tradable allowances. That's what cap and trade means. The House bill will require 80% reduction in emissions by 2020. Council, has the EPA required greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced by 80% nationwide by 2050, or set any other national standard?
No, no clarity has been given on what EPA plans to do with their GHG regulations.
Just a minute. That's just not an accurate statement. EPA has said what they want to do. What you're saying is EPA can do other things, but they're not saying they're going to do it, so that's not an accurate answer to the question.
Just a minute. The gentleman from...
I yield to the chairman.
You don't control the time. The gentleman from Nevada controls time. Gentleman's
just said what I
recognized.
said. The council should just give us factual questions of what the law is, not speculation of what EPA may do under certain. This is far beyond answering the question. And I would admonish council that if a question's asked, you shouldn't speculate. You should answer the question. EPA is proposing to do certain things now. Period. Thank you.
Well, we know these regulations are not completed, so we have no idea what they're going to do. But the gentleman from Mr. Madison, you control the time.
Yield back to Mr. Rush.
Yeah.
Gentleman's recognized for
The
48 seconds.
PSD permit requirements won't affect most existing facilities, and EPA has said future regulation will focus on power plants and refineries. So EPA's regulations aren't cap and trade. They cover far fewer sources, and they wouldn't achieve anywhere near the same emissions reductions as the House bill. Council, do the Clean Air Act greenhouse gas requirements include a renewable electricity standard?
No.
Do the Clean Air Act requirements include a national building retrofit program to increase the energy efficiency of homes and commercial buildings?
Different efficiency policies have begun under these rulemakings, but not that
Yes or no?
one.
No. Is your answer no? The
Not
answer to
that,
the question
not
is
that
no.
efficiency policy.
Is that a no answer? No.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. Your
Yes,
answer is
it's
no.
a no. Yes.
Do the Clean Air Act requirements invest in carbon capture and storage technologies?
Carbon capture and storage.
Is that a yes or no?
Possible,
Yes or-
yes, it is a possible per EPA's back guidance.
Possible?
It is a possible. It is a possible backed technology. Carbon capture and sequestration.
Well, is there currently technology that exists?
No, there isn't, but EPA's backed guidance included CCS as a possible backed technology.
Time's expired. Does anyone else seek recognition at this time? Gentleman from Texas, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, let me respond to my colleague and the Chairman Emeritus on the Republican side, Joe Barton. In his line of questioning, I think we're going to get to the point where if we really want to solve the problem, it may be 6 months from now or a year from now. I would suggest the new majority not wait like we did on the Senate acting on something before we come back and start doing something. And because, that's going to be the problem, because I want to be able to deal with it on a reasonable basis, and I do think Congress needs to be the leader on this instead of the EPA. With that, I'd like to yield my time to Congressman Inslee.
Thank you. I want to ask the question of counsel. At a hearing this week, the Republicans called a scientist named Roger Pilkey, and the Republican scientist testified that black carbon pollution, which is a product of combustion, is contributing to some of the damage we've seen in the Arctic, to the Arctic ice sheet, basically accelerating the melt of the Arctic ice sheet, some of which I just addressed in the new NASA findings this morning. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has also found that black carbon contributes to climate change, and I have a bill that will help address that problem. Council, I'd like to ask you about how this bill addresses black carbon pollution. And if we look at page 2, lines 16 to 18, if the EPA sought to regulate black carbon pollution under the Clean Air Act in order to address its contribution to climate change and its subsequent problems in human health, the language of this bill would actually prevent the Environmental Protection Agency from acting on it. Is that correct?
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Sure, if I can get enough time, yeah.
My understanding, and I don't claim to be quite as knowledgeable on some of the technicalities as the gentleman from Washington, is that CO2 is a greenhouse gas and is colorless and invisible. black carbon is a particulate matter, and as such would be covered by the Clean Air Act's original criteria pollutants for particulate matter. So this bill wouldn't affect black carbon. Now, black carbon may be a new term that I'm not familiar with. So could you enlighten the committee on, when you say black carbon, exactly what are you referring to?
Carbon that is black in the sort of
okay.
in the physical chemistry of which I'm associated with, and I never questioned the gentleman's from Texas understanding. But let's go through this with the council, and then maybe I can.
But you're not referring to CO2 then?
No, that's correct. I'm referring to black carbon. It is a particulate matter. The gentleman's correct in that regard. So, but here's the point I want to make, and I want to make sure I understand this. My reading of the bill would say that under the bill, if the EPA sought to regulate black carbon under the Clean Air Act in order to address its contribution to climate change, the language of this bill would prevent the EPA from acting upon it, would it not? And I'm referring specifically to page 2, lines 16 through 18.
This legislation would prohibit regulation of black carbon only to the extent that the regulation was for the purpose of addressing climate change. EPA would be able to continue to regulate it as particulate matter.
So I want to make sure I understand this. I ask you a very specific question. If the EPA sought to regulate black carbon under the Clean Air Act in order to address its contribution to climate change, this language will prevent the EPA from regulating it based on that reason, would it not?
Yes, but it...
So the answer is yes, which is the correct answer, and it is an important correct answer for this reason. I want to point out this irony that I think we all ought to be aware of. 2 days ago, the Republican Party brought its scientist that it asked to come testify about this subject to this committee. That scientist told us that black carbon, this is contributing to climate change and the destruction on a massive scale of the Arctic, which is a regulator of our climatic system. It is sort of the heating, the air conditioning system for the planet is melting because of black carbon in part. This bill, to me, is a little bit ironic that the Republicans bring a witness. They tell us there's a problem that we have, this scientist, because of black carbon, and now you prohibit us from regulating it on this basis. I think it's bad juju.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Council, I'm not sure that your yes, it may have been accurate but not total answer. The EPA, as a particulate matter, has every right to regulate black carbon today. Correct?
Yes, that's correct. And EPA...
Without any further congressional action.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, correct.
All right.
And EPA's position is that black carbon is not a well-mixed, long-lived greenhouse gas, but rather an aerosol particulate.
And they, under the Clean Air Act, have a right to regulate it.
And in fact, it is already regulated on rules like the heavy-duty diesel truck rule.
Very good. Then, not yet. I've got one more question. Then Jay.
Thanks.
Getting back to Mr. Doyle's line of questioning, we talked about the EPA's discretion in where they're setting the amount of carbon tons per year, and that they are setting those, and that the EPA, well, first of all, the first question is the EPA is setting those, I don't know what the right term would be, but setting the amount of CO2 that would then trigger EPA's regulations, correct?
Correct.
And Congress has not set the carbon greenhouse gas threshold that would trigger either permitting or regulating.
Correct.
And the Clean Air Act has a citizen right of action, correct?
Yes.
Isn't it frequently used by environmental groups when they disagree with the EPA's decision on not to enforce the Clean Air Act on a particular industry?
Yes.
Or when the EPA uses their own thresholds of which would trigger permitting or regulating?
Yes.
Okay. So even though Lisa Jackson may come here and say, we have no intention to regulate feed yards of cattle or hogs, the reality is that the Environmental Defense Fund or Sierra Club or just an individual in collaboration with can bring a lawsuit which would force the EPA to use a lower standard or enforce on a particular industry, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So we have no certainty as we sit here today that feedlots in Nebraska aren't going to be regulated by the EPA tomorrow, despite what the director of the EPA said in front of this committee.
There are provisions which allow for lawsuits to be brought.
All right. Mr. Inslee?
Yeah,
I'll yield
I
to you.
appreciate because I think this is an important point. I think it's worthy of our discussion. As I understand what council has had us to understand, and I'm going to use some hypothetical numbers here for the purposes of this question. If the EPA determined that 1,000 parts per million is endangering human health, let's say because it causes respiratory distress, if this passes, the EPA would still be allowed to regulate black carbon if it made that finding, correct? If they already regulate black carbon. As a particulate. Okay, now here's the problem. If the EPA concludes that, let's say, a level of 500, half the parts per million, they may not be directly injurious to human health from a respiratory standpoint. But if they conclude that 500 parts per million endangers human health because it's melting the Arctic, which as the regulator of the planet's climate will end up in us suffering
Would the
health
gentleman
effects.
yield, or would
Yeah.
Yeah, just let me
My
finish.
time, and I do want just
let me finish
few
the question.
seconds
Let's
for
get
me
him
to wrap
answered.
up.
No.
So if
But the point is, if
could
the
you
EPA
get to the point.
Mr. Terry controls the time. Now, who are you yielding to who?
I got to reclaim my time just so I can wrap up. By the way, black carbon U.S. emissions total 6% of the world's emission or particulates of black carbon. Mr. Ross, very quickly, I yield to you. Corey Gardner, whatever the heck.
Thank you, Mr. The gentleman from Nebraska. Can a particulate be a gas?
Pardon me?
In your opinion, can a particulate be a gas?
No.
Thank you.
But I'm a lawyer. Our 2 seconds.
Mr. Chair,
Gentleman
Mr.
yields
Chair,
back his time.
Mr. Chair, could I make
For
can I
what
unanimous
purpose?
consent just to finish?
For what
this?
purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I'd ask unanimous consent to have 60 seconds to finish my question and get an answer. If I
Gentleman
can.
asks unanimous consent for 60 seconds to complete his question.
Thank you. What I want to make clear is that if this bill does become law and the EPA decides that 500 parts per million will have destructive action on the Arctic and thenceforth cause health impacts in America associated with climate change, this bill would prevent the EPA from acting on that basis, would it not?
Yes, but EPA has concluded that there is no direct impact on human health.
I understand, but again, I just want to make sure that
Current or projected.
if the EPA concludes there is indirect human health effects due to climate change precipitated and aggravated by black carbon, which is the second worst thing we've got, and by the way, this is the fastest thing we can do to reduce this problem is regulate black carbon, then this bill would prevent the EPA from doing that, wouldn't it, on that basis?
To address climate change, but they still have the authority to regulate it as a particular.
I appreciate your answers. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Does anyone else seek recognition? Does anyone have an amendment that they would like to offer to the bill? If there are no amendments, the question would now occur on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill approved by the subcommittee today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Is there any further business to come before the subcommittee? If not, the chair thanks all the members and the staff very much for their participation. The subcommittee stands adjourned, subject to call of the chair.